It's official, New York has a new mayor. Zoran Kwame Mamdani, a Democratic politician born in Uganda, is now the center of attention. And not just because he's the mayor of one of the biggest cities in the world, but because of what it means to have a self-proclaimed democratic socialist at the helm of Wall Street, the heart of the global financial system. Yeah, you heard correctly. The mecca of capitalism is in the hands of a socialist who has already promised to freeze rents across half the city, raise the minimum wage to $30 an hour, give away free bus tickets, and even create a few city-run grocery stores. In total, he plans to increase public spending by an estimated $10 billion, more than half of which will go toward free childcare for children up to the age of 5. According to Mamdani, all this will be paid for by Wall Street, and more specifically, by its billionaire executives. But we aren't here today to talk about the new mayor of New York, not least because he doesn't actually have the authority to carry out almost any of his proposals on his own. No, today we're here to talk about New York. Specifically, we're here to talk about this.
As new jobs in finance dry up, New York City's fiscal model is wilting.
Since the pandemic, workers in New York's private sector have lost more than 10% of their purchasing power. As a result, the current hourly wage is lower than it was in 2007, just before the housing bubble burst. This is completely exceptional, because Americans elsewhere in the country are more than 10% richer than they were back then. In fact, according to some indicators, New Yorkers' disposable income, that is, what they have left in their pockets after paying taxes and fixed expenses such as housing, places the city in the poorest half of the United States. Yes, you heard that correctly. The poorest half. And the worst part is, everything indicates that the situation will not improve. On the contrary, even if Mamdani does not come to power, the problems will remain. And naturally, this leaves us with several uncomfortable questions. Is New York following in Detroit's footsteps? Why does the mecca of capitalism appear to be in freefall? And what on earth is going to happen in the coming years? We'll tell you all about it in this video. The decline of New York has one clear protagonist: Wall Street. So if we want to understand what's going on, we have to go to the source, to the moment when this city first became the financial epicenter of the planet. And for that, we have to go back to the very beginning, to the birth of the United States. When the 13 colonies gained independence from England, New York was important, yes, but it was nothing special. Just another port city where goods simply passed through. It wasn't even the most important port. That title belonged to Boston. You've probably heard of the Boston Tea Party, when the colonists threw shipments of British tea into the water. Well, that didn't happen in New York, but in Boston. But wait, New Yorkers had an ace up their sleeve that Boston couldn't match: geography. New York had the Hudson River, wide, deep, navigable. What's more, it had access to the Great Lakes and crucial cities such as Chicago. Boston was ideal for trading with England, but New York was the gateway to the heart of the United States. And it showed. In 1820, both ports handled similar amounts, about $12 or $14 million. But 40 years later, boom! New York was exporting $145 million worth of goods, while Boston barely exceeded $17 million. Yes, 8.5 times less. And it didn't end there. Thanks to trade, New York ceased to be a simple port and became a manufacturing powerhouse. Economies of scale did the rest.
The rise of New York's three great manufacturing industries in the 19th century, sugar refining, publishing, and the garment trade, depended on New York's place at the center of a transport hub. In all three cases, manufacturing transformed products from outside the US into finished goods that would be sold within the country.
In 1820, just before the commercial boom, there were 9,500 people working in the industrial sector in New York. Just 30 years later, that figure would rise to 43,500. And interestingly, I bet you didn't know this: sugar refining became the city's leading economic activity. In fact, even as recently as 1900, it was still number 2. However, the industrial boom did not last long. At its peak, New York accounted for 20% of all manufacturing jobs in the United States. 1 in 5 industrial workers in the country was based there. But like all empires, the glory didn't last forever. From the second half of the 19th century onwards, the city began to lose momentum, little by little, with one exception, that brief surge during World War II. The result, by 2000, New York accounted for just 5% of the national industry, 4 times less than a century and a half earlier. Okay, you may be wondering, but when are you going to talk about Wall Street and the decline of the city? Don't worry, we're getting there, and believe me, this little detour will help you understand everything much better, because the big question here is, why did New York become deindustrialized? Well, because what geography gives you, geography can also take away. For decades, New York played 2 winning cards: ridiculously low transportation costs, a massive population concentrated in one place. But then came the automobile, the tractor, trucks, highways, and suddenly transporting things was no longer a problem. The outcome? Factories no longer needed to be crammed into expensive cities like New York. They could move to cheaper areas with more space. And so, by the 1970s, the average salary in Wayne County, in the heart of Detroit, was higher than in the Big Apple. But just when all seemed lost, the wheel of fortune turned again, and New York, once again, came out on top. Because if cheaper transportation had sunk its industry, cheaper telecommunications were about to make it even more lucrative. You know the rest. Detroit sank, and New York took off like a rocket. Check out this graph. It compares average wages in several iconic US cities, from the 1970s to the 2000s. New York practically doubled their wages. Meanwhile, in the Midwest, total stagnation. But wait, this new New York was no longer an industrial powerhouse. No factories, no steel, no smoke. Now, yes, the city of Wall Street emerged. It all started innocently enough. The financial companies in this famous neighborhood began by insuring sea voyages. Pretty straightforward. But then came government debt bonds. And after that, everything else. And when cell phones and the internet reduced communication costs by more than 95%, New York had all the ingredients to make it big. Interestingly, many thought that these technologies would do the same thing that cars had done decades earlier. They would empty cities, facilitate relocation, and send everything to the suburbs. Spoiler alert, that didn't happen. Why? Because the new economy wasn't about factories, it was about ideas. And ideas don't just pop up in the middle of nowhere, they come when lots of smart people get together, mix, and compete. And there's no better place for that than a big city. By then, Silicon Valley had already taken over technology. So, New York chose another path: finance. And it wasn't exactly starting from scratch. It had centuries of experience in trade, debt, stocks, and what's more, an ace up its sleeve: the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the most powerful branch of the US central bank. The results were immediate. By the 1990s, 1 in 10 New Yorkers was already involved in the financial world, and they were earning real fortunes well above the rest of the country. But and here comes the twist. As we warned you at the beginning of the video, this story does not have a happy ending. After a few decades of glory, New York began to follow the same path as Detroit: a slow, silent, and, until now, unstoppable economic decline. The reason? Take a look at the following chart. Although it may be hard to believe, Wall Street's influence on the New York economy has been declining for more than 3 decades. In the 1990s, this sector employed 11.5% of the city's workers. Today, it barely reaches 7%, and there's more. Across the United States, the financial sector created 230,000 new jobs. How many do you think stayed in New York? Half? A third? Not at all. Barely 19,000. Less than 10%. Meanwhile, the city has experienced a real boom in nurses, doctors, and social workers. In other words, rather than a financial capital, New York is starting to look like a luxury nursing home. And if you're one of those people who think that finance is smoke and mirrors and that we should go back to doing real things, well, you should know that in New York, that's not working out very well. It's true that during the early years of the new millennium, salaries continued to rise, but more slowly than in the rest of the country. And you know how these things work. Crises start slowly, and then suddenly, boom, they explode. That's what happened with the pandemic. The New York economy, which was already struggling, ended up collapsing. Decades of bleeding in the financial sector eventually took their toll. The result? Today, wages in the Big Apple are at the same level as they were 20 years ago. That's how things stand. But why? Why has Wall Street, with all its history and advantages, lost its prominence? If you've been following the video closely, you could probably guess. Geography and technology, once again, have changed everything. Remember when we said that the telecommunications revolution could have favored decentralization? Well, perhaps that prediction wasn't so wrong. It's just that the effect has taken longer to materialize. These days, JP Morgan has more employees in Texas than in New York, and it's not the only one. One by one, the big banks are packing their bags and fleeing the Big Apple.
Goldman Sachs has nudged managers to move to Dallas and Salt Lake City. As of last year, Morgan Stanley is the largest employer in Alpharetta, a distant suburb of Atlanta. In July, Citigroup announced that it will expand its operations in Charlotte, North Carolina.
Keep in mind, technological changes continue to favor large cities, but now the massive concentration of people is no longer as decisive, and workers can move more easily between different urban centers. Of course, let's be honest, technological and graphical determinism is not absolute, not at all. If a city is losing its best workers, it's because it has failed to adapt to change, and that is the fault of politics. New York has the largest welfare state in the United States. Yes, even more than California. To give you an idea, it spends 70% more than Texas and 130% more than Florida. And how is all this financed? With taxes. Lots of taxes. For example, there are businesses that pay almost 20% corporate tax just at the local level, the same as the federal rate. So, double the amount. For years, this wasn't a problem. Why? Because Wall Street professionals were trapped. Yes, they paid a lot, but they couldn't go anywhere else and continue to earn the same high salary. They couldn't till now. Now, they're fleeing as if New York were the epicenter of a zombie apocalypse. Between 2010 and 2022, the percentage of New Yorkers earning more than $1 million a year fell from 13% to 9%. And between 2018 and 2023 alone, 10% of households earning more than $10 million left. 10%. A real drain. And what does that mean in terms of money? Well, if they hadn't left, New York would be collecting $13 billion more today. Enough to recover all the public spending planned by the new socialist mayor, and still have 30% left over. But it's not all about taxes. There's another factor that pushes the rich and companies to pack their bags: regulations. For example, in New York, companies are allowed to use only audited artificial intelligences to prove they're not sexist or racist, literally. And of course, the big banks and investment funds have done the math and decided to move to Texas. And if that seems excessive, wait until you see the cost of living. Due to taxes and regulations, car insurance costs around $1,700 a year, and in the rest of the country, it's around $400. But what's truly scandalous is housing. It's no coincidence that the flagship proposal of Mamdani, the new mayor, has been to freeze rents. The average rent is around $3,600 per month. That's 50% more expensive than in the other 50 largest cities in the United States. The average household earns around $70,000 a year. And even then, more than half of that goes to paying rent. That's 10% more than 35 years ago. And that's despite 2/3 of rental apartments being under some form of price control. But that is precisely the big problem with this city.
The probability of finding a rent-stabilized unit is approximately 11% per year for a relatively affordable, low-quality unit, and 26% for a more expensive, high-quality unit. The average wait time for public housing is approximately 19 years.
Price controls cause a shortage of new housing because the business is simply not profitable. Therefore, prices skyrocket. The solution? More rent controls. And it's back to square one. It's a vicious cycle. In short, geography is fixed, but depending on the technology of the time, a city can become the crown jewel or become the next Detroit. New York knew how to make the most of its enormous advantage as a commercial port to create a huge city, perfect for the internet age, but the city rested on its laurels. And now that it's easier than ever to move around, it's no longer an attractive place for the workers and companies that paid for the party. So, is there time to prevent the fall of the mecca of capitalism? Well, it seems impossible to avoid it completely. But the reason people are leaving isn't because the city's geography is particularly bad, but rather due to the city's policies. So who knows, maybe there's still time to avoid the worst. Although, to be honest, it doesn't look like New York is heading in the right direction. Be that as it may, now it's your turn. Did you know that salaries in New York have have been in freefall for several years. Are city policies really to blame, or was it all inevitable? Do you think we'll see a rebirth of the financial world? Will we see another sector flourish, or is this legendary city doomed to never recover? Let me know your answers down in the comments and let's open up the debate. If you enjoyed this video, please go ahead and like the video. And if you're not already subscribed, go ahead and subscribe to Visualeconomik as we release new videos every single week. Thank you so much for watching. All the best. I'll see you next time. Cheers.